And I know that a day like this can feel overwhelming. But I feel like because today feels overwhelming, because I feel like we kind of hit the wall with both of those arguments today, with those positions on behalf of the president and his supporters, I feel like this might be a time to kind of, like, just look at what's going on here for a second. Just line these things up, right? So deep breath. Let's start at 0 and go to 60 here. Let's just do this. Where this started was with a dark horse, unconventional presidential candidate who took oddly pro-Russia and pro-Vladimir Putin stances during the primary, right? And it started off as a curiosity, right? When nobody thought he had a chance of winning, it was an odd trivia point about him. There was that joshing moment between the then Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and the man who's now the leader of the House Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, where McCarthy sort of half-joked, half-asserted that as far as he was concerned, one person he was pretty sure was on the Vladimir Putin payroll was Donald Trump. It was like a joke. It was a weird observation that you could make about Trump. This was a strange quirk about him. Early on in the primary that led ultimately to him getting the nomination, you might remember that he became the first and ultimately the only Republican candidate who said Russia shouldn't have any U.S. sanctions on them at all. He was against the U.S. sanctioning Russia for anything it had done. We would later learn that the person who asked him the question that teed up that answer from him is someone who would go on to be charged in federal court as a secret agent who was working illegally for the Kremlin in this country. I mean, it's still amazing to look back on that. But the person during the campaign who asked candidate Trump what he thought of Russian sanctions, and he said, we should definitely get rid of all Russian sanctions, and he thinks he'll get along great with Vladimir Putin. The person who teed him up to say that, who asked him that question, was Maria Butina, who is currently in federal prison for being a Russian agent. And, fun fact, she's due to be released the day after tomorrow. She's due to get out of federal jail and be deported back to Moscow on Friday of this week. After that weird, auspicious beginning in terms of him talking about Russian sanctions, that candidate would go on to secure the Republican presidential nomination. When his campaign hit some turbulence in advance of the Republican convention, the candidate made a surprise decision to hire a new guy to run his campaign, someone who hadn't worked on U.S. politics in years. Trump hired a new campaign chairman who he didn't know. His only recent experience in presidential politics was presidential politics in Ukraine, where he was working for pro-Putin political parties, specifically working for a Ukrainian president who tried to turn that country away from the West and instead secure its alliance with Moscow. That work that Manafort did for pro-Putin interests in Ukraine had been financially supported very richly by a series of Kremlin-connected oligarchs. And they paid him a little bit on the books, apparently quite a bit off the books. They also engaged in a whole bunch of shady business dealings with him that, in retrospect, look an awful lot like schemes for large-scale money laundering. Manafort's finances were a crime scene, and he would ultimately be arrested and prosecuted for having taken millions of dollars of those off-the-books payments and not paying any U.S. taxes on them. He was convicted of multiple felonies, and before what was due to be his second federal felony trial, he signed a cooperation agreement with prosecutors, a plea deal that theoretically would have saved him from that second federal trial and reduced his time in prison. He said he would cooperate. That should have really helped him. But he only said he would cooperate. He didn't actually go on to really cooperate with prosecutors. Prosecutors would soon be back telling the court that Manafort, despite this plea agreement, despite his cooperation pledge, he repeatedly lied to those prosecutors he was supposed to be cooperating with. He didn't give them any useful information they could use for other prosecutions or for the broader Mueller inquiry. In fact, those prosecutors told the court that Manafort used his supposed cooperation agreement to help other subjects of the inquiry who were possibly in prosecutors' crosshairs. Specifically, they said he back-channeled to the Trump White House information about what Mueller's investigators were asking, what they were looking for, what they were zeroing in on in their investigation that might be particularly relevant to the fate of President Trump. Because of Manafort's duplicity and his lack of cooperation, he ended up getting lots of years in federal prison. We, the American public, ended up getting no insight at all into the stuff that you might think prosecutors wanted him to come clean about when they thought he was going to be a cooperator. His apparently ongoing dealings, financial dealings, with the pro-Putin oligarchs he'd known from Ukraine. His ongoing financial dealings with them during the time he was running the Trump campaign. I mean, he took no salary from Trump's campaign, remember? But for some reason, he proposed to at least one of these pro-Putin oligarchs from Ukraine that something about the Trump campaign should help Paul Manafort get whole in terms of his debts to those pro-Putin interests. What was he offering to do from his position as chairman of the Trump campaign that would be so beneficial to these pro-Putin interests that it would allow him to forgive his debts? In the Mueller report, we learned that prosecutors also never got to the bottom of why Manafort was sending detailed Trump polling and strategy information via encrypted apps to his intermediary to those pro-Putin oligarchs. I mean, the guy who Manafort sent all that Trump campaign data to during the campaign, all that polling, is somebody who prosecutors say is actively linked to Russian intelligence. What does Russian intelligence want with all the Trump campaign strategy data and polling data for the Rust Belt? That guy to whom Manafort sent all that Trump campaign data was himself indicted by federal prosecutors. He apparently fled to Moscow to avoid prosecution, and he's still at large. Manafort remains in prison, which itself is one of the most astonishing things you could say about any president, right? I mean, his campaign chairman sits in prison during the term of the president who he helped elect. I mean, that itself is crazy enough. But from his prison cell, he hasn't just been working on his abs. The president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, says Manafort has been providing strategic advice to Giuliani, as Giuliani, at President Trump's direction, has been running a sort of shadow foreign policy in Ukraine in which the U.S. basically stopped supporting Ukraine in its ongoing war with Russia. Instead, on the basis of some fairly insane claims that have been promoted in Russian state media, that it wasn't Russia who intervened in our 2016 election, it was actually Ukraine. And Ukraine has the DNC server that the Russian government hacked. And Joe Biden somehow arranged for Paul Manafort to have taken all those millions of dollars and bought himself ostrich leather jackets instead of paying U.S. taxes on that money. I mean, this scheme that President Trump is now being impeached for, this scheme to extort and pressure Ukraine into cooking up an exoneration of Russia and cooking up and publicly announcing new, more politically useful fake investigations and fake claims that Giuliani and Trump and honestly Paul Manafort can use here at home for their own purposes. Paul Manafort, from his prison cell, has been advising on this scheme. And as serious as this turns out to be in our politics, it's also a life and death thing. Russia really has invaded Ukraine. There is a live, hot war there where people are being killed. We are Ukraine's most important ally. We're their most important source of military support against Russia. This deadly serious, real-world corollary to our impeachment drama is that this whole scheme also screwed Ukraine while they have been invaded by Russia, while they are fighting this war. We have abandoned them in the middle of a hot war against an adversary that really is trying to take over that country and take it for itself. Right? But it's all one story, right? I mean, it's all the same guys. It's all the same aims. It's all the same beneficiaries. And even if President Trump's supporters in Congress are trying to physically shut down the impeachment inquiry, and his lawyers in court are arguing today that he could walk into that courtroom and start shooting people in that courtroom and nobody would have any legal right to stop him from doing that, let alone charge him for it. I mean, as the defense of the president in this crisis gets almost literally crazy, every piece of this scandal redounds to him. Right? We need to learn who all the characters are. We need to see how all these plot points connect. We need to hear all the depositions from the witnesses. We need to see all the evidence. But it all redounds to him. All of it. Starting with this odd story we've now lived through, which started in 2015 when he became a very strange candidate for president with very weird ideas about the world at large and one foreign country in particular that would go on to intervene in our election to try to install him in the White House. Right? It starts there. And yes, now we've got all these characters, but they're all part of that same story that started there. We've got one of these pro-Putin oligarchs who financed Paul Manafort's pro-Putin work in Ukraine. He's now hired these pro-Trump lawyers. They, in turn, hired new help. They hired at least one of these guys who were supposedly helping with the Dmitry Firtash criminal case, whose activities were reportedly being financed by Firtash. These guys were supposedly arranging meetings for Rudy Giuliani all over Ukraine as Giuliani pushed this scheme to invent this whole plot line of allegations to use against the Democrats and to try to exonerate Russia and What, to try to spring Paul Manafort too? I mean, everybody involved here looks like they're potentially in criminal trouble. Dmitry Firtash, the oligarch guy, is fighting extradition to this country to face charges in a huge corruption case. Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, is a person of interest in at least 2 federal investigations. Giuliani's guys, who apparently were also Firtash's guys, they were arraigned in federal court today. One of them was represented by Paul Manafort's lawyer. That was Igor. The other one, Lev, pulled the world's most amazing rabbit out of the hat today in federal court in New York. Lev today in federal court, his lawyer claimed there may be some complications when it comes to prosecutors in his case reviewing material that has been seized by search warrants. He said there might be some complications with that, since some of that material might implicate attorney-client privileges involving the President of the United States? What, for Lev's case? I mean, as far as we know, Lev is not a lawyer. But his attorney explained today in court that Rudy Giuliani was working for the president as his lawyer, and Lev was, quote, working for Mr. Giuliani, quote, in that capacity. Which seems insane even for the funny papers, let alone for a federal court hearing, right? That somebody working for a pro-Putin oligarch who is under indictment in this country and who prosecutors say is a upper echelon associate of Russian organized crime, a person in that position working for that guy could also be part of the president's legal team in his defense in the Russia investigation? What? I mean, Lev Parnas in court is saying that there's going to be executive privilege issues involved in some of the evidence against him because it has to do with the president's legal representation because he was on that team. I mean, in the wildest fantasies about this insanity that we are living through in the Trump presidency, nobody would have ever claimed that a guy linked to the Kremlin and to Russian organized crime would somehow get installed on the president's legal defense team in the Russia scandal. But apparently that's where we are. I mean, the Wall Street Journal did just publish pictures from Lev Parnas's private Instagram account. And in fact, there he is at the celebratory dinner that the president's legal team held the night that William Barr said the Mueller investigation was over and that Mueller report would have nothing in it. You can see from the picture that he posted, there's Rudy Giuliani. Oh, there's Jay Sekulow. This is Lev's Instagram. This is the Trump legal team, including Lev, who's also working for Firtash, who's under indictment and linked to the mob. And there's this incredible moment at the arraignment today for Lev and Igor, where the judge says to Lev's lawyer, quote, "You're not suggesting that your client worked for the president, are you?" Well, yeah. Because Rudy Giuliani worked for the president and Lev worked for Giuliani? Or maybe it was Giuliani working for Lev? I mean, remember, just like Paul Manafort worked for Trump for free, Rudy Giuliani is working for Trump for free as his lawyer. The entity here who we actually know is paying Rudy Giuliani is Lev. Giuliani says Lev's company, some entity associated with Lev Parnas, has paid him $500,000. Trump's not paying him, Lev is. Through this whole scheme, throughout this whole time as the president's bizarre personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani is not being paid by President Trump. He is being paid by Lev. And where is Lev getting the money to do that? Well, Lev appears to be getting paid by the indicted foreign oligarch who ran Paul Manafort for all those years in Ukraine, who's been taking orders from the Kremlin for years, and who is said by U.S. prosecutors to be an upper echelon associate of Russian organized crime. That's where the money comes from for these guys. That's where the president got his legal defense team for the Russia scandal. And for this whole cast of geniuses who hatched this plot to screw Ukraine, this plot that will now result in the president of the United States being impeached, if not removed from office. That depends on whether Republicans decide they agree with him that no crime of his matters, no matter what it is, no matter how egregious. I mean, I know the news feels like it's going fast here, but just look at it, take it 0 to 60. Take it back to the beginning. Ultimately, there is one scandal here, tip to tail. And yes, part of it will result in the president's impeachment, at least in the House. But it is all one scandal. The impeachment is just the part for which they are now inescapably caught.
Hey Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.